Peter and his family were forced into exile in 1966 from here. And when Peter then went on to be based in the UK, he continued his anti-apartheid leadership in that space, and then moved on and into politics more seriously, more formally, should I say, later in his career, and eventually went into the House of Commons in 1991.
Already this year, 3,000 desperate refugees have drowned in the Mediterranean trying to get into Europe. 250,000, mostly Africans, are waiting in Libya now to make the crossing. There are more fences being erected on Europe's borders than there were in the Cold War. Britain, one of the largest economies, voted last June to leave the European Union by 52% to 48%, the country badly split. Can Europe, a rich but aging continent, rise to the challenge of coping with an unprecedented refugee crisis? Fascist and populist parties are on the rise everywhere in Europe. Terrorist attacks occur or are thwarted across the continent, and relationships with a newly aggressive nationalistic Russia are very bad. Criminal smugglers make a fortune. In 2015, from 80 to 100 boats a day crossing the Mediterranean, bringing 1 million refugees, a third of these children, as part of the biggest movement of people that Europe has faced since 1945. Across Europe, migrants have become the scapegoat, the problem politically toxic. Even though their youth and skills, 40% of Syrian refugees are graduates. The Syria crisis is apocalyptic, a disaster of biblical proportions with over 4 million refugees. But the second largest group of contemporary refugees is from Afghanistan. About 20% are Afghans. Others come from Eritrea, Libya, Liberia, Burma, Congo, Iraq, Somalia, Ethiopia, Sudan, Mali, and Bhutan. Meanwhile, a year ago, thousands of desperate people, mostly from Syria, were hounded by Hungarian policemen ready with tear gas, their Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, making virulently Islamophobic statements about Muslims being a threat to European civilization. Germany, Austria, Hungary, Denmark, Sweden, and others quickly erected border controls. A domino effect saw Bulgaria, Romania, and outside the EU, Serbia sealing their borders too, leaving Greece and Italy, simply because of where they happen to be geographically, close to Syria and Libya, forced to shoulder the burden of hundreds of thousands of desperate people. The awful attacks in Cologne last New Year's Eve by 1,000 men of Arab and North African appearance, including 117 sexual assaults and rapes on women, provoked a backlash against refugees and the barbed media label rapefugees. Disintegration of states in the Islamic world, unable to manage different ethnic and political differences, and a seemingly impotent international system led by the United Nations mean that these trends could be with us for the foreseeable future. And remember, one estimate suggests 80% of the world's refugees are in developing countries. Yet less than 9% are hosted by the 6 wealthiest nations, accounting for 60% of global GDP. But for nearly 4 decades now, really since the advent of Reagan and Thatcher, we've suffered from neoliberal ideology. That's to say, a small government ideology favouring market forces wherever possible and tolerating state regulation only where absolutely necessary. Economic and social inequality has widened massively, and you know about that in your own country. Not just the poor, but the middle classes, and this is also important, have experienced a relative decline in living standards, while the rich have become super rich. The top 10% have benefited, the rest have fallen behind. In France, the rise of the Front National, taking former communist working class voters and socialist working class voters to their own to vote for them. In Greece, Golden Dawn on the fascist right and Syriza propelled to government on the populist left, with PASOK, the mighty socialist party, in quotes, that helped deliver Greece from fascism, virtually extinguished. In Germany, Denmark, And Hungary, the rise of far-right parties. In Austria, a far-right candidate for the presidency only narrowly defeated by a Green candidate, not by the two traditional big parties. In Poland, right-wing government restrictions on the judiciary, media and civil service, triggering a formal European Union investigation. Even in social democratic Sweden, in its general election in September 2 years ago, the far right more than doubled its support to 13% and came third. A similar revolt against the political class, I think, lies behind Donald Trump's success in the USA and the unexpectedly close challenge by Bernie Sanders, an avowed socialist. Is Germany imposing upon Greece, because it really is Germany leading this charge in Europe, the kind of austerity it itself suffered under the Versailles Treaty after the First World War, with the appalling economic and political consequences that produced. Governments, including ours in Britain, insist that there's no alternative to cuts and still more cuts to reduce high levels of national debt and borrowing caused by the Great Recession that the 2008 global financial crisis and bank bailouts triggered. Today, due to the massive action that governments across the world first out to bail out bust banks and stop the slide into slump, and then to promote recovery from recession triggered by that banking crisis, national debt levels and annual budget deficits are much higher than they were in 2007. The British referendum on June the 23rd took place against that background. It was a massive kick to the political class. Immigration trumped the economy, even though the great bulk of British trade, nearly half our trade in total, is with other European Union countries. And millions of jobs and the country's prosperity depend upon that trade. The Remain campaign agreed that the EU does need reform, but insisted that was why Britain needed to be right there on the pitch as a key player, not sitting in the stands moaning as a spectator. British membership has been a considerable economic success, according to credible academic research, which says that membership has raised UK income levels appreciably. The positive economic effects and benefits of membership have far outweighed the cost in the Brexit campaign's terms of Britain's EU contributions and red tape by a factor of about 7 to 1. Until Europe finds a solution to these challenges, its leaders' vision of a peaceful, democratic, prosperous and globally influential continent is seriously endangered. To its great credit, the ANC government, over 400,000 extra places at universities. That's fantastic. But the system cannot be financed in the old way. And also, graduates are the most privileged group of society. So you've got that problem. You've also got the problem that half the debt in Britain, nearly half the debt, and I suspect it's at least that the case here, is never repaid. So the governments introduce a fee system because the university finance is not sustainable. It's what happened in Britain. The fees go up, and that's happened in South Africa. Because the original system of subsidy, you cannot do it with the numbers that you've got, given the hard, tough fiscal choices all governments have to make. But you can't even recover half of that debt. So what sort of policy is this? You introduce it to reduce your public spending, and you end up with a big burden on your public spending. And so not only create hardship, but it actually is dysfunctional in terms of government finances. I favour a graduate tax, whereby the government lends the money to universities, as it does now in South Africa and Britain, to cover the fees. And students pay that back once they get in a job. If you look at this in British terms, it'll be roughly about 2p on top of a basic income tax rate of 20p. I don't think graduates would notice that, frankly. And I think you'd come, and then they pay that throughout their lives, and it shows that you can fund the university system that way. So I would recommend that we in Britain do that, because we have a completely dysfunctional and discriminatory fee system, and I suspect you have too. The people of South Africa succeeded in overthrowing apartheid, and the ANC led that. Its ideals do not seem to me to be being reflected in the way South Africa is being governed at the moment. I think the economy, is being badly neglected. I mean, the school system, I'm horrified. In the global school performance index. Out of 140 odd countries, South Africa is 138. Below for school performance, below Benin and Mauritania and countries like this that are desperately poor. This is unacceptable. Not only is it failing school children in South Africa, but also where's all that money gone? I mean, to its great credit, the ANC not only built millions of houses and brought millions of electricity and running water. That's fantastic achievements compared to the legacy of the apartheid. But how do you, and pump masses of money, one of the highest levels of investment per child in a comparable country, and sometimes even with industrially more advanced countries. South Africa, to the level of spending, there's lots of money going into schools, but the standards are terrible. And you have to change that, because if you can't offer your children a future, you're not going to offer your economy a future. On the widening inequality, I think you have to have a change in the economic system, because I think this form of rampant capitalism, greedy, rapacious, selfish capitalism, is actually going to kill itself, as well as prevent people from getting a decent living. You have to close that inequality gap. And yes, you do it through taxation, but you do it also through the system investing to create growth, and through governments creating growth to give people a greater chance. I mean, one of the exciting things for me is seeing the incredibly able, sort of dynamic, young African women and men in their 30s and 40s and younger, who are going to make this country in the future if the government allows them to.